The desert wind carried the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder across the Afghan mountainside as Staff Sergeant Marcus Ghost Rodriguez pressed his back against the rocky outcropping. Blood seeped through his tactical vest, where shrapnel had torn through Kevlar and flesh alike. His left leg throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of the IED that had torn his world apart 3 hours ago. The mission had started like any other. Intelligence indicated a high-value target hiding in a compound nestled between two ridgelines, approximately 15 clicks north of their forward operating base. Rodriguez and his SEAL team had executed hundreds of similar operations. They moved like shadows through the pre-dawn darkness, each man knowing his role without need for words. Rodriguez had been point man, his reputation for sensing danger having earned him the call sign Ghost years earlier. But even Ghost could be caught off guard. The explosion had come from nowhere, a pressure plate ID buried beneath what appeared to be ordinary desert sand. The blast had thrown Rodriguez 10 feet backward, his ears ringing so loudly he couldn't hear his own screams. When the dust settled and his vision cleared, he found himself alone. His team had been forced to retreat under heavy fire, leaving him behind enemy lines with a mangled leg and rapidly diminishing ammunition. Now, as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, Rodriguez assessed his situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 7 deployments. His radio was damaged beyond repair, crushed when he hit the rocks. His left leg was definitely broken, possibly in multiple places, and he could feel bone fragments grinding against each other with every slight movement. Worst of all, he was completely cut off from friendly forces in Taliban-controlled territory. Rodriguez had always prided himself on being self-sufficient. Growing up in the housing projects of East Los Angeles, he had learned early that showing weakness meant becoming prey. His father had abandoned the family when Marcus was 8, and his mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. The streets taught him that asking for help was a luxury he couldn't afford. When he enlisted in the Navy at 18, that same mentality had served him well. The SEAL teams valued independence and mental toughness above all else. During his grueling training at Basic Underwater Demolition School, Rodriguez had watched dozens of stronger, faster candidates ring the bell and quit because they couldn't handle the psychological pressure. But Rodriguez had endured. He had embraced the pain, the exhaustion, the constant mental warfare that instructors used to break weak minds. When his boat crew was forced to carry their inflatable boat over their heads for miles of soft sand running, Rodriguez had gritted his teeth and pushed forward. When instructors made them lie in the surf for hours in near-freezing water, he had found a place in his mind where the cold couldn't reach him. That same mental fortress had protected him through 7 years of special operations. He had been wounded before, bullet grazes, knife cuts, concussion from explosions, but he had always patched himself up and continued the mission. Asking for medical evacuation was something other people did. Rodriguez was different. Rodriguez was stronger. But this was different too. The sound of approaching voices made him freeze. Arabic words carried on the wind, getting closer by the minute. Rodriguez checked his ammunition count, 2 full magazines plus a partial third. His sidearm was intact with 2 spare magazines. If it came to a firefight, he might be able to take a few with him, but his chances of survival were essentially 0 in his current condition. Moving carefully to avoid making noise, Rodriguez began crawling toward a cluster of boulders that might provide better cover. Each movement sent lightning bolts of agony through his shattered leg, but he forced himself to continue. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the morning chill, and he could taste blood where he had bitten through his tongue to avoid crying out. The voices were getting closer. Rodriguez could make out at least 3 distinct speakers, possibly more. They were conducting what sounded like a systematic search, checking every possible hiding spot. It was only a matter of time before they found him. As he reached the relative safety of the boulder field, Rodriguez allowed himself a moment to rest. He pulled out his emergency medical kit and began treating his wounds as best he could. The leg was beyond field treatment, but he could at least slow the bleeding from his other injuries. As he worked, muscle memory took over, hands moving automatically through procedures he had practiced thousands of times. His mind wandered to his daughter Sophia, now 6 years old, and living with her mother in San Diego. The last time he had seen her was 3 months ago, before this deployment. She had made him a card with crayons, a stick figure drawing of the two of them holding hands under a smiling sun. "Come home safe, Daddy," she had written in her careful first-grade handwriting. The card was tucked in his vest pocket now, probably stained with blood. Rodriguez had always told himself that his dangerous job was worth it because he was protecting people like Sophia. Every terrorist he eliminated, every weapons cache his team destroyed, every intelligence operation they conducted, it all served the greater purpose of keeping America safe. But, sitting alone in this godforsaken wasteland, bleeding and broken, he wondered if that was really true or just something he told himself to justify the adrenaline addiction. The search party was close enough now that he could hear individual footsteps on the rocky ground. Rodriguez chambered around and waited. If they found him, he would go down fighting. It was the only way he knew how to die. But death would have to wait. The voices began to fade as the search moved past his position, heading toward the valley floor. Rodriguez allowed himself to breathe again, but he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They would be back, probably with more men and possibly with tracking dogs. His scent trail was fresh enough that any competent tracker could follow it. As the day wore on, Rodriguez's condition deteriorated. The pain in his leg had evolved from sharp agony to a constant, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He was becoming dehydrated despite rationing his water supply, and the combination of blood loss and shock was making it difficult to think clearly. By afternoon, the temperature had climbed into the triple digits. The rocky shelter that had provided protection from enemy searchers now became an oven that baked him slowly. Rodriguez used his survival training to create shade using his poncho, but it provided only minimal relief. Every few minutes, he would scan the horizon with his scope, watching for signs of movement. It was during one of these surveillance sweeps that he spotted them, a patrol of American soldiers moving along the ridge line about 2 kilometers away. Rodriguez's heart raced as he identified the distinctive silhouettes and movement patterns of U.S. forces. They appeared to be Marines based on their equipment and formation. This was his chance. All he had to do was signal them somehow, get their attention without also alerting any nearby enemy forces. Rodriguez reached for his emergency signaling mirror, a small piece of reflective metal designed for exactly this purpose. But, as he positioned it to catch the sunlight, his hands began to shake. Not from the physical trauma. Rodriguez had operated through worse injuries before. This shaking came from somewhere deeper, a place he had spent years learning to suppress. It was fear, but not fear of death. Rodriguez had made peace with mortality long ago. This was fear of appearing weak, of admitting that the invincible ghost Rodriguez needed help from anyone. His training officer's voice echoed in his memory. "A SEAL who can't take care of himself is a liability to the team. Dead weight. We don't carry dead weight in the teams." Rodriguez had internalized that lesson so completely that even now, facing death alone in enemy territory, the idea of calling for help felt like betrayal of everything he stood for. But Sophia's face appeared in his mind again, that gap-toothed smile, and the way she would run to him when he came home from deployments. She needed her father to come home, even if it meant swallowing his pride. Rodriguez positioned the mirror and began flashing the Morse code distress signal toward the Marine patrol. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. The universal call for help that transcended national boundaries and military branches. As the afternoon sun reflected off his small mirror, bouncing light across the valley, Rodriguez felt something crack inside his chest. Not physically, emotionally. A wall that had stood for 32 years was beginning to crumble. The Marine patrol had stopped. Rodriguez could see them through his scope, pointing in his direction and apparently discussing what they had seen. One of them raised binoculars and began scanning the area where the light signals had originated. Rodriguez flashed the SOS sequence again, more urgently this time. But then, something went wrong. The Marines began moving away from his position, heading back the way they had come. Rodriguez flashed the signal again and again, desperation replacing calculation. They were leaving. His one chance at rescue was walking away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the Marine patrol disappeared over the ridge, Rodriguez felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: complete helplessness. The man who had survived everything from Arctic warfare training to counter-terrorism operations in 3 different countries was reduced to lying bleeding behind a rock, waiting for death or capture. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Rodriguez heard the voices again. This time there were more of them, at least 6 distinct speakers from what he could determine. They had brought dogs. He could hear barking in the distance. His temporary safety was about to end. Rodriguez checked his weapons one final time and prepared for what would likely be his last firefight. He thought about Sophia, about his team members who had made it out safely, about his mother who still lit candles for him at church every Sunday. He thought about all the things he would never get to say, all the apologies he would never make. But, most of all, he thought about how different things might have been if he had learned earlier in life that asking for help wasn't the same as admitting defeat. That sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was acknowledge their limitations and trust others to help carry the load. As the search party closed in on his position, Rodriguez realized that pride might be the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced. It was certainly the most persistent. Even now, with death approaching and no hope of escape, part of him was still more afraid of appearing weak than of dying. The barking was getting closer. Rodriguez could see movement. The helicopters arrived like thunder from heaven. 2 CH-47 Chinooks escorted by a pair of Apache gunships that immediately began circling the area in tight defensive patterns. Rodriguez watched through his scope as the lead Chinook flared for landing in a clearing approximately 400 meters from his position. The rotor wash kicked up enormous clouds of dust and debris, creating a brownout that would provide perfect cover for both rescue operations and enemy movement. The sound of the helicopters had also alerted every hostile force within 10 kilometers to exactly where the Americans were operating. Rodriguez could hear shouting voices from multiple directions now as enemy fighters converged on the area. What had started as a search and rescue operation was rapidly becoming a full-scale battle. Rodriguez keyed his emergency beacon, hoping the rescue team would be able to home in on his signal through the chaos. He had managed to jury-rig a weak radio signal, using components from his damaged equipment, but he wasn't sure if it was transmitting clearly enough for the pilots to locate him. Through the swirling dust, Rodriguez could see figures moving toward his position from the direction of the helicopters. American forces, judging by their equipment and movement patterns. But they were taking heavy fire from multiple positions, forcing them to move slowly and carefully. Every few seconds, Rodriguez could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles and the heavier thump of rocket-propelled grenades. One of the Apache gunships rolled in hot, its 30mm chain gun chattering as it engaged targets on the ridge line above Rodriguez's position. The sound was deafening, but Rodriguez had never heard anything more beautiful. Each burst of cannon fire meant enemy fighters who wouldn't be shooting at the rescue team. But the enemy was adapting quickly. Rodriguez watched in horror as a rocket-propelled grenade streaked up from a concealed position and impacted against the Apache's tail section. The helicopter shuddered and began smoking, fighting to maintain altitude as warning lights flashed in the cockpit. The pilot was skilled enough to keep the damaged bird in the air, but Rodriguez knew they were running out of time. The rescue team was making progress toward his position, but they were still at least 200 meters away. Rodriguez could see them leapfrogging from cover to cover, one group providing suppressive fire while another group advanced. It was textbook small unit tactics, but textbook wouldn't be enough if the enemy managed to surround them. Rodriguez made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Instead of waiting passively for rescue, he decided to help the team reach him. Using his remaining strength and ammunition, he began engaging enemy positions that were threatening the advancing Americans. His elevated position gave him excellent fields of fire, and his years of sniper training had taught him how to make every shot count. The first target was an enemy fighter with an RPG launcher who was lining up a shot at the rescue team. Rodriguez put a bullet through the man's center mass at 300 meters, dropping him instantly. The second target was a machine gun nest that had been pouring fire down on the Americans from a fortified position. Rodriguez put 3 rounds into the position, silencing the gun. But Shooting revealed his location to every enemy fighter in the area. Within seconds, bullets were ricocheting off the rocks around him as multiple shooters turned their attention to his position. Rodriguez was forced to hunker down behind his inadequate cover as automatic weapons fire chewed apart the stone around him. That's when he heard something that made his blood run cold, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Someone in the enemy force had called for indirect fire support, and they were bracketing his position. The first rounds impacted 50 meters short, sending razor-sharp stone fragments flying through the air. The second salvo landed 50 meters long. The third would be right on target. Rodriguez pressed himself as flat as possible against the rocky ground and waited for death. The mortar rounds screamed down from the sky like falling meteors, their warheads packed with enough high explosive to vaporize anything within a 20-meter radius. He thought about Sophia one last time, about how she would grow up without a father, about all the soccer games and school plays he would never see. But the killing blow never came. At the last possible second, one of the Chinooks swept in low over the ridge line, its door gunners spraying suppressive fire at the enemy mortar position. The mortar team was forced to abandon their weapons and seek cover, their rounds falling harmlessly into the valley below. Rodriguez looked up to see American soldiers rappelling down ropes from the hovering helicopter, fast roping directly into the combat zone rather than attempting a safer landing. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver under the best of circumstances, and this was far from the best of circumstances. But it would put rescuers on the ground within 50 meters of his position, cutting the danger zone by 3/4. The first soldier to hit the ground was clearly a Marine, identifiable by his distinctive equipment and the way he moved. Rodriguez could see the man's face clearly now. Young, maybe 22 or 23, with the kind of intense focus that came from months of combat experience. The Marine immediately began returning fire at enemy positions while his teammates continued rappelling down. But something was wrong. Rodriguez could see that the Marine was moving awkwardly, favoring his right side. Blood was seeping through his uniform shirt, indicating that he had been wounded either during the insertion or by ground fire. The young man was hurt, possibly seriously, but he was still fighting to reach Rodriguez's position. More Marines hit the ground in quick succession, forming a defensive perimeter around the helicopter's position while the pilots fought to maintain a steady hover under fire. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different enemy positions, all focusing their fire on the exposed Americans. The situation was rapidly becoming unsustainable. Rodriguez tried to help by engaging targets that were threatening the rescue team, but his ammunition was running critically low. He had perhaps 20 rounds remaining, enough for 1 or 2 more engagements before he would be reduced to his sidearm. Every shot had to count. The wounded Marine was now close enough that Rodriguez could see his face clearly. The young man couldn't have been more than a year or 2 out of high school, with the kind of baby face that made him look even younger than his actual age. But his eyes held the steady determination of someone much older, someone who had seen enough combat to understand what was at stake. The Marine was calling out something, but Rodriguez couldn't make out the words over the constant gunfire and helicopter noise. The young man was gesturing toward Rodriguez's position, apparently trying to coordinate the final approach with his team members. But enemy fire was getting heavier by the minute as more fighters arrived to join the battle. That's when disaster struck. A rocket-propelled grenade launched from a concealed position impacted directly beneath the hovering Chinook. The explosion damaged the helicopter's hydraulic systems, forcing the pilot to immediately break contact and head for an emergency landing zone. The Marines on the ground were now cut off from their primary extraction method, stranded in enemy territory just like Rodriguez. The tactical situation had gone from rescue operation to desperate survival in a matter of seconds. The Marines were now taking fire from 3 sides, pinned down in a rocky depression with limited ammunition and no immediate prospects for reinforcement. Rodriguez realized with growing horror that his rescue attempt had instead doomed 8 more Americans to death or capture. But the young Marine who had been wounded during the insertion wasn't giving up. Rodriguez watched in amazement as the kid began moving again, crawling from boulder to boulder despite his injuries. Enemy fire was so intense that dust and stone chips were flying constantly. But the Marine kept advancing toward Rodriguez's position. Rodriguez tried to provide covering fire, but his ammunition was nearly exhausted. He managed to drop one enemy fighter who was about to flank the Marine's position, but that left him with only a few rounds remaining. Soon he would be completely helpless, unable to contribute anything to the fight except another casualty for the enemy to claim. The Marine reached a position about 30 meters from Rodriguez and began calling out again. This time Rodriguez could make out some of the words. "Can you move? Extract in 2 minutes." The young man was trying to coordinate a fighting withdrawal, but Rodriguez's condition made rapid movement impossible. Rodriguez tried to respond, but his voice was hoarse from dehydration and pain. The best he could manage was a weak wave to indicate that he was conscious and able to communicate. The Marine acknowledged with a quick thumbs up and began speaking rapidly into his radio, apparently calling for immediate extraction. But extraction from where? The primary landing zone was under heavy fire. The backup zone was probably compromised by now, and enemy forces were converging from all directions. Rodriguez had been in enough combat situations to recognize when tactics were giving way to pure desperation. The Marines were trapped, and their situation was getting worse by the minute. The wounded Marine began moving again, this time directly toward Rodriguez's position. Enemy fire followed his movement, bullets striking the rocks so close that Rodriguez could feel stone fragments hitting his helmet. The kid was risking his life for someone he had never met, someone whose name he didn't even know. As the Marine got closer, Rodriguez could see that his wounds were more serious than they had initially appeared. Blood was soaking through his uniform in multiple places, and his breathing was labored. But his rifle was steady, and his movements were controlled. Whatever training had produced this young warrior had been extraordinarily thorough. 20 meters. 15. 10. Enemy fire was so intense now that both men were forced to keep their heads down constantly. Rodriguez could hear bullets whining overhead like angry hornets, some passing so close that he could feel the pressure waves. Death was measured in inches and milliseconds. The Marine finally reached Rodriguez's position, sliding into the rocky shelter with practiced ease despite his wounds. Up close, Rodriguez could see that the young man was even younger than he had estimated, probably 19 or 20 at most. His name tape read Chun, and his rank insignia showed him to be a lance corporal. "Sir, are you able to move at all?" Chun asked, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Rodriguez was struck by the young Marine's professionalism. Even in this desperate situation, Chun was following proper protocols and maintaining military courtesy. "Negative," Rodriguez replied, gesturing toward his mangled leg. "Compound fracture, possibly multiple. I can provide covering fire, but that's about it." Chun nodded and began examining Rodriguez's wounds with quick, efficient movements. His hands moved like those of someone with extensive medical training, checking pulse points and assessing the severity of various injuries. Rodriguez noticed that Chin's own wounds were bleeding steadily, but the young Marine seemed completely focused on the rescue mission. "We're going to get you out of here, sir," Chin said, beginning to apply fresh bandages to Rodriguez's worst injuries. "Extraction bird is inbound, but we need to move to a better position. Can you handle being carried?" Rodriguez felt that familiar resistance rising in his chest. Being carried meant being completely dependent on others, admitting that he couldn't take care of himself. Every instinct screamed against accepting help, especially from someone young enough to be his son. But looking at Chin's determined face, Rodriguez realized something important. This wasn't about him anymore. The young Marine and his team had risked their lives to attempt a rescue. If Rodriguez's pride got them all killed, their sacrifice would be meaningless. Sometimes accepting help wasn't about weakness. It was about honoring the courage of people who were willing to help. "Do what you have to do," Rodriguez said, the words coming easier than he had expected. The journey toward the extraction zone became a nightmare of pain and chaos that tested every limit of human endurance. Chen had fashioned a crude stretcher using ponchos and broken pieces of equipment, but the rocky terrain made smooth movement impossible. Every step sent shock waves of agony through Rodriguez's shattered leg, and several times he came close to losing consciousness entirely. But What struck Rodriguez most profoundly wasn't the physical pain. He had dealt with pain before. It was the complete trust he was being forced to place in Chun and the other Marines. For the first time in his adult life, Rodriguez's survival depended entirely on other people's actions. He had no control over the tactical situation, no ability to influence the outcome through personal skill or determination. He was cargo, and that realization cut deeper than any physical wound. Chun and 3 other Marines moved with Rodriguez between them, taking turns carrying the stretcher while fighting running gun battles with enemy forces that seemed to materialize from every direction. The young Lance Corporal had taken charge of the rescue operation with a competence that belied his age and rank. Rodriguez watched in amazement as Chun coordinated movement, directed suppressive fire, and provided medical care, all while dealing with his own serious wounds. The extraction landing zone was still 200 meters away when the situation took another turn for the worse. Enemy mortar rounds began falling with devastating accuracy, guided by spotters who had managed to get visual contact on the American position. The first salvo landed close enough to shower the team with dirt and rocks. The second was even closer. "They've got us bracketed," Chen shouted over the noise, gesturing for his team to take cover behind a cluster of boulders. "We need to call off the extraction until we can suppress that mortar position." Rodriguez felt a familiar surge of frustration at his helplessness. If he were mobile, he could help locate the enemy spotters and eliminate them. His sniper training and years of combat experience would be invaluable in this situation. But instead, he was forced to lie bleeding on a stretcher while younger, less experienced Marines risked their lives to save his. "Sir, we're going to need you to stay low and quiet for a few minutes," Chin said, checking Rodriguez's bandages for fresh bleeding. "My team is going to try to flank that mortar position. Once we eliminate it, the extraction bird can come in safely." Rodriguez wanted to protest, to insist that he could help despite his injuries. But, looking at Chin's determined face, he realized that arguing would only waste time and potentially get people killed. Instead, he nodded and settled back against the rocks, watching as the young Marines prepared for what amounted to a suicide mission. The enemy mortar position was located on high ground approximately 300 meters away, protected by natural rock formations, and defended by an unknown number of fighters with automatic weapons. To reach it, Chin's team would have to cross open ground under heavy fire, then assault a fortified position while outnumbered and outgunned. The tactical odds were overwhelmingly against success. But Chin was already moving, leading his 3 teammates in a coordinated assault that demonstrated training and discipline far beyond what Rodriguez would have expected from such young warriors. The Marines used every piece of available cover, advancing by fire and movement while laying down accurate suppressive fire on enemy positions. Rodriguez watched through his rifle scope as Chin's team closed the distance to the mortar position. The young Lance Corporal was clearly in pain from his wounds, but his movements remained controlled and purposeful. He directed his teammates with hand signals, coordinating their assault with the precision of a much more experienced leader. The attack reached its climax when Chin personally led a frontal assault on the mortar position while his teammates provided covering fire from the flanks. Rodriguez saw the young Marine charge directly into enemy fire, his rifle blazing as he closed with defenders who had every advantage except courage. It was an act of such raw bravery that Rodriguez felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that true heroism had nothing to do with rank, experience, or reputation. The mortar position fell silent. Chin's voice crackled over the radio, calling for immediate extraction now that the primary threat had been eliminated. Within minutes, Rodriguez could hear helicopter rotors approaching from the south, a sound that had never been more welcome. But, as the rescue helicopter approached, Rodriguez realized that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. Watching Chun and his Marines risk everything for a wounded stranger had forced Rodriguez to confront uncomfortable truths about his own motivations and limitations. For years, Rodriguez had defined his worth through personal achievements and individual heroics. He had cultivated an image of invincibility that became central to his identity. But Chen had demonstrated something far more valuable: the willingness to sacrifice personal glory for the welfare of others. The young Marine hadn't been trying to prove anything to anyone. He had simply been doing what was necessary to save a life. The extraction went smoothly once the mortar threat was eliminated. Rodriguez found himself loaded aboard a medical evacuation helicopter, surrounded by corpsmen who immediately began working to stabilize his condition. As the aircraft lifted off from the landing zone, Rodriguez caught a final glimpse of Chun and his team through the open cargo door. The young Marines were already preparing to move to a secondary extraction point where they would await their own pickup. Chun was binding fresh bandages around his wounded side, but he paused long enough to give Rodriguez a thumbs up as the helicopter climbed away from the battle zone. It was a simple gesture, but Rodriguez understood its meaning. Mission accomplished, no one left behind. During the flight to the forward surgical hospital, Rodriguez had time to reflect on what had just happened. For the first time in his military career, he had been completely dependent on others for survival. It should have been humiliating, a devastating blow to his carefully constructed self-image. Instead, Rodriguez found himself feeling something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine gratitude. Chun and his Marines had risked their lives for someone they didn't know, someone from a different service branch who represented nothing more than another American in need of help. They had asked for nothing in return except the chance to do their jobs with honor and competence. It was a level of selfless service that Rodriguez realized he had been pursuing his entire career, even though he hadn't understood it until now. The medical team worked on Rodriguez throughout the flight, stabilizing his leg and treating his other injuries. The doctors were skilled and professional, but Rodriguez barely noticed their efforts. His mind was focused on processing what had happened to him, both physically and psychologically, during those crucial hours in the Afghan mountains. By the time they reached the field hospital, Rodriguez had come to several important conclusions. First, accepting help from others wasn't a sign of weakness. It was recognition that no one could survive alone in a hostile world. Second, true strength came not from individual achievements, but from the bonds formed between people who were willing to sacrifice for each other. Third, and most importantly, his entire understanding of what it meant to be a warrior had been fundamentally wrong. The surgeon spent 6 hours reconstructing Rodriguez's shattered leg, installing titanium plates and screws to hold the bone fragments together. When he woke up in the recovery ward, his first thought was about Chun and whether the young Marine had made it safely out of the combat zone. A Navy corpsman noticed that Rodriguez was awake and approached his bedside with a clipboard full of paperwork. "How are you feeling, Staff Sergeant? You've been out for about 8 hours. "The Marines who extracted me," Rodriguez asked, his voice hoarse from the anesthesia. "Did they make it out okay?" The corpsman smiled and consulted his notes. "All accounted for, sir. Lance Corporal Chun and his team were extracted about 2 hours after your pickup. Chun required surgery for his wounds, but he's expected to make a full recovery." Rodriguez felt a wave of relief that surprised him with its intensity. During his years as a SEAL, he had always been concerned about the welfare of his own teammates, but he had never felt such personal investment in the fate of strangers. Something about Chun and his selfless actions had created a bond that transcended normal military relationships. Over the following days, Rodriguez's physical condition improved steadily. The surgeons were optimistic about his chances for a full recovery, though it would require months of rehabilitation and physical therapy. But Rodriguez found himself more interested in the psychological healing that was taking place alongside his physical recovery. For the first time in his adult life, Rodriguez was forced to depend completely on others for basic needs. Nurses helped him eat, wash, and move around his hospital bed. Physical therapists worked patiently to restore mobility to his damaged leg. Doctors made decisions about his care without consulting him. It should have been intolerable for someone who prized independence above all else. Instead, Rodriguez discovered that accepting help allowed him to appreciate things he had never noticed before. The quiet competence of the medical staff, the genuine care they showed for their patients, the way they worked as a team to achieve shared objectives. It all reminded him of what he had seen in Chun and his Marines during the rescue operation. Rodriguez began to understand that his obsession with self-reliance had actually made him weaker, not stronger. By refusing to acknowledge his limitations or accept assistance from others, he had cut himself off from one of humanity's greatest sources of strength, the willingness of good people to help each other in times of need. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant Rodriguez no longer had to carry every burden alone. Terrifying because it required him to fundamentally reconsider everything he thought he knew about strength, courage, and honor. On his 5th day in the hospital, Rodriguez received an unexpected visitor. Chen appeared at his bedside, walking with a slight limp, but otherwise looking remarkably healthy for someone who had been wounded in combat less than a week earlier. "How are you feeling, sir?" Chen asked, settling into the chair beside Rodriguez's bed with the careful movements of someone still recovering from injury. "Better every day," Rodriguez replied. "But I should be asking you that question. I heard you needed surgery too." Chen shrugged, downplaying his own injuries in the way that warriors had done for centuries. "Nothing too serious. Couple of stitches, and I'll be good as new." The two men talked for over an hour, sharing stories about their backgrounds and experiences. Rodriguez learned that Chun had grown up in a small farming community in Iowa, the son of immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give their children better opportunities in America. The young Marine had enlisted straight out of high school, motivated by a desire to serve something larger than himself. "I never expected to see combat this soon," Chun admitted. "But when that call came in about a wounded SEAL who needed extraction, there wasn't any question about whether we would respond. That's what we do." Rodriguez found himself studying Chen's face as the young Marine spoke. There was no bravado, no need to impress or intimidate. Chen simply described his actions as part of his job, no different from any other mission he might be assigned. It was a level of humble professionalism that Rodriguez aspired to match. As their conversation continued, Rodriguez realized that he wanted to tell Chun something important, something that might help the young Marine understand the impact his actions had made. But finding the right words proved surprisingly difficult. "Chun," Rodriguez finally said, "what you and your team did out there, it wasn't just a rescue operation. You saved more than my life. You taught me something about what real strength looks like." Chun looked puzzled, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would consider his actions particularly noteworthy. "We just did our jobs, sir. Any Marine would have done the same thing." Rodriguez shook his head. "No, it was more than that. You showed me that accepting help isn't the same as being weak. That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is trust other people to help carry the load." The young Marine was quiet for a long moment, considering Rodriguez's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My grandfather used to tell me that no one succeeds alone. He said the strongest people are usually the ones who understand how much they need others." As Chun prepared to leave, Rodriguez felt compelled to make one more statement. "If there's ever anything I can do for you or your Marines, anything at all, you just have to ask. And I mean that." 6 months after the rescue operation, Rodriguez found himself standing at the entrance to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. His leg had healed remarkably well, though he would always walk with a slight limp that served as a constant reminder of that day in the Afghan mountains. But the physical scars were nothing compared to the psychological transformation he had undergone during his long recovery. Rodriguez was no longer the same man who had once prided himself on needing no one. The months of rehabilitation had forced him to work closely with doctors, nurses, physical therapists, and fellow patients, people whose expertise and support had been essential to his recovery. More importantly, he had learned to appreciate the strength that came from being part of something larger than himself. Today marked a significant milestone. Rodriguez was returning to active duty with a new assignment as an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. Instead of leading combat operations, he would be responsible for training the next generation of Navy SEALs. It was a role that would allow him to pass on not just tactical skills, but the deeper lessons about teamwork and mutual support that Chun had taught him. The decision to accept the instructor position had not been easy. Rodriguez's commanding officers had offered him the opportunity to return to his operational unit, and part of him yearned for the adrenaline and purpose of combat missions. But Rodriguez had come to understand that teaching might be the most important mission of his career, an opportunity to prevent other warriors from making the mistakes he had made. Rodriguez's first class consisted of 24 candidates in their final phase of SEAL training. These were men who had already survived months of physical and psychological testing, the elite survivors of a selection process that eliminated more than 80% of candidates. They were tough, motivated, and supremely confident in their individual abilities. They were also, Rodriguez realized, exactly like he had been at their age. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez began, addressing the assembled candidates, "you've made it through the hardest part of your training. You've proven that you can endure physical hardship, mental stress, and extreme fatigue. You've demonstrated that you have the individual skills necessary to be Navy SEALs." The candidates sat at attention, their faces reflecting the pride and confidence that came from having conquered seemingly impossible challenges. Rodriguez could see himself in their expressions, the same conviction that he was invincible, the same belief that asking for help was a sign of weakness. "But individual skills are only part of what makes an effective SEAL," Rodriguez continued. "The most important lesson you need to learn is one that can't be taught through physical training or tactical exercises. It's the understanding that no one, not even the strongest, fastest, or smartest among you, can succeed alone." Rodriguez spent the next several weeks working with the candidates on advanced tactical exercises, but he structured the training differently than traditional SEAL instruction. Instead of emphasizing individual performance, he designed scenarios that required genuine teamwork and mutual dependence. Candidates who tried to operate independently found themselves failing exercises that could only be completed through collaboration. One particular exercise involved a simulated hostage rescue in an urban environment. The scenario required precise coordination between multiple teams, with each team responsible for a specific aspect of the operation. Rodriguez deliberately assigned the most individualistic candidates to roles that required them to depend completely on their teammates for success. Petty Officer First Class Mike Torino was Rodriguez's biggest challenge. Torino was physically gifted, tactically brilliant, and supremely confident in his own abilities. He was also completely resistant to the idea that he might need help from anyone else. During team exercises, Torino consistently tried to take on responsibilities beyond his assigned role, convinced that his superior skills would lead to better outcomes. "Torino," Rodriguez said after one particularly frustrating exercise, "you just got your entire team killed because you decided to improvise instead of following the plan." Torino's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Sir, I saw an opportunity to complete the mission more efficiently. If the rest of the team had been faster, Rodriguez interrupted. "Petty Officer, your job was to provide overwatch while your teammates breached the target building. Instead, you abandoned your position to pursue what you thought was a better plan. Your teammates died because they were counting on support that wasn't there." Rodriguez could see the resistance in Torino's eyes, the same stubborn pride that had nearly gotten Rodriguez killed in Afghanistan. The young SEAL candidate was convinced that his individual excellence should be enough to overcome any tactical challenge. That evening, Rodriguez decided to share his own story with the class. He had never spoken publicly about the rescue operation, partly out of respect for the Marines who had saved his life, and partly because the experience still felt too personal to discuss casually. But watching Torino struggle with the same demons that had haunted Rodriguez for years convinced him that the story needed to be told. "6 months ago, I was wounded in Afghanistan," Rodriguez began, noting how quickly the classroom fell silent. "I was trapped behind enemy lines with a broken leg, no radio, and limited ammunition. By every measure that I had previously used to define myself, I was a failure. I couldn't complete the mission, couldn't extract myself, couldn't even communicate with friendly forces." Rodriguez described the rescue operation in detail, emphasizing his initial resistance to accepting help and the internal struggle he had faced. He talked about Chun and the young Marines who had risked their lives for a stranger, and about how their selfless actions had forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about strength and courage. "I had spent years believing that needing help was a sign of weakness," Rodriguez concluded. "But those Marines taught me that real strength comes from understanding when you need others and being willing to accept their help. They also showed me that the highest form of courage isn't individual heroism, it's the willingness to sacrifice for others. The impact of Rodriguez's story was immediate and profound. Several candidates had tears in their eyes, and even Torino appeared to be reconsidering his previous attitudes. But Rodriguez knew that changing deeply ingrained beliefs would require more than one inspirational speech. It would take consistent reinforcement and practical demonstration. Over the following weeks, Rodriguez implemented a series of increasingly challenging exercises designed to break down the walls of individual pride that prevented effective teamwork. He created scenarios where success required candidates to admit their limitations and ask for help from teammates. He assigned roles that forced strong personalities to follow rather than lead, and leadership responsibilities to candidates who preferred to remain in supporting roles. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult exercise that required teams to navigate through a complex obstacle course while carrying a wounded teammate. The twist was that the wounded member rotated throughout the exercise, forcing every candidate to experience both sides of the dependency relationship. When it came time for Torino to be carried by his teammates, Rodriguez could see the young man's internal struggle. Everything in Torino's training and personality resisted the idea of being dependent on others. But as his teammates worked together to transport him through the obstacle course, something seemed to click in his understanding. "Sir," Torino said after the exercise was completed, "I think I'm starting to understand what you've been trying to teach us." Rodriguez nodded encouragingly. "What did you learn, petty officer?" "When I was being carried, I realized that my teammates weren't weak for needing to work together. They were actually stronger as a group than any of us could have been individually. And I wasn't weak for needing their help. I was smart for trusting them to come through." It was exactly the kind of breakthrough Rodriguez had been hoping for, but he knew that real change would require sustained reinforcement. Over the remaining weeks of training, he watched as Torino gradually transformed from a lone wolf into a genuine team player, someone who sought opportunities to support his teammates rather than opportunities to outshine them. The transformation wasn't limited to Torino. The entire class began approaching challenges differently, automatically looking for ways to combine their individual strengths rather than competing with each other. They started asking for help when they needed it, offering assistance before being asked, and measuring success in terms of team accomplishment rather than personal achievement. Rodriguez found the teaching experience more rewarding than any combat mission he had ever completed. Watching young warriors learn to trust and depend on each other reminded him daily of the lessons Chun had taught him in those Afghan mountains. Every successful exercise, every moment of genuine teamwork, every breakthrough in understanding felt like a small victory against the culture of toxic individualism that had nearly destroyed Rodriguez's own career. As the training cycle neared its end, Rodriguez received word that Chun would be visiting the base as part of a liaison assignment between Marine and Navy Special Operations units. Rodriguez hadn't seen the young Marine since his visit to the hospital, but he had followed Chun's career through informal channels. The Lance Corporal had been promoted to Corporal and was reportedly being considered for advanced leadership training. When Chun arrived at the training center, Rodriguez was struck by how much the young Marine had matured in just 6 months. There was a new confidence in his bearing, a quiet authority that suggested he had grown comfortable with leadership responsibilities. But the core qualities that had impressed Rodriguez during the rescue operation, the humility, the genuine concern for others, the selfless dedication to mission accomplishment, were still clearly evident. "I hear you're teaching now," Chun said as they walked through the training facilities together. "How's that working out?" Rodriguez smiled, thinking about Torino and the other candidates who had gradually learned to embrace teamwork over individual achievement. "It's the most important mission I've ever had. I'm trying to pass on what you taught me out there." Chun looked puzzled, as if he still couldn't understand why anyone would consider his actions during the rescue operation particularly noteworthy. "I didn't teach you anything, sir. You already knew how to be part of a team. You just needed a reminder." They paused at the window, overlooking the obstacle course where Rodriguez's current class was conducting team exercises. Down below, candidates were working together to overcome challenges that would have been impossible for any individual to complete alone. Rodriguez watched with satisfaction as even the strongest and most confident candidates actively sought help from their teammates. "You see that?" Rodriguez said, pointing to a particularly good example of teamwork playing out on the course. 6 months ago, those men would have tried to complete that exercise individually. They would have failed, but they would have preferred failure to asking for help. Now they automatically work together. Chen studied the exercise with professional interest. That's good leadership on your part, sir. You're creating the conditions for them to learn the right lessons. Rodriguez shook his head. I'm just repeating what you showed me. That real strength comes from understanding how much we need each other. As they watched the training exercise continue, Rodriguez reflected on how much his life had changed since that day in the Afghan mountains. He was still a highly skilled warrior, still capable of operating independently when necessary. But he was no longer defined by his independence. Instead, he had learned to find strength in connection, purpose in service to others, and meaning in the bonds formed between people who were willing to sacrifice for each other. The wounded SEAL had become something more than he had ever been when he was trying to be everything on his own. He had become part of something larger, something stronger, something that could accomplish things no individual could achieve alone. Chen's visit lasted 3 days, during which he participated in several training exercises and shared his own experiences with Rodriguez's candidates. The young Marine's presence reinforced many of the lessons Rodriguez had been trying to teach, and his stories about successful operations emphasized the importance of teamwork and mutual support. On his final evening at the base, Chun and Rodriguez sat on a bench overlooking the Chesapeake Bay, watching the sun set over the water. It was a peaceful scene, far removed from the chaos and violence of their first meeting in Afghanistan. Sir, Chin said after a long, comfortable silence. Can I ask you something? Rodriguez nodded. Of course. Do you ever regret what happened? Getting wounded, I mean. Having to accept help. Rodriguez considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, he would have answered immediately that of course he regretted it. The injury had ended his operational career, forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, and challenged everything he thought he knew about strength and independence. But now, watching his students learn to work together as a team, Rodriguez realized that the rescue operation had been the most important thing that had ever happened to him. It had forced him to grow beyond the limitations of his own pride and showed him a better way to serve his country and his fellow warriors. 2 years had passed since Rodriguez began his new mission as an instructor, and the impact of his teaching philosophy was beginning to ripple through the special operations community. Former students who had graduated from his program were now serving in operational units around the world, and their reports consistently highlighted the effectiveness of teams that truly understood how to work together rather than simply coordinate individual efforts. Rodriguez had been promoted to Master Chief Petty Officer, a recognition not just of his tactical expertise, but of his contributions to developing a new generation of warriors who embodied the values of mutual support and collective strength. His reputation as an instructor had spread beyond the SEAL community, and he was frequently invited to speak at other military training facilities about the importance of team cohesion and interdependence. But Rodriguez's most significant challenge was yet to come. The Pentagon had selected him to develop a joint training program that would bring together special operations candidates from all service branches, SEALs, Marines, Army Rangers, and Air Force pararescue specialists. The goal was to create a shared understanding of teamwork principles that would improve coordination between different units during complex operations. The assignment was both an honor and a tremendous responsibility. Rodriguez would be working with some of the military's most elite and independently minded warriors, people who had been selected precisely because of their individual excellence and self-reliance. Convincing them to embrace mutual dependence would require all the skills he had developed as an instructor, plus insights he hadn't yet discovered. Rodriguez spent months developing the curriculum for what would be called the Joint Special Operations Leadership Course. The program would last 6 weeks and would bring together 48 candidates from the 4 service branches. Unlike traditional military training that focused primarily on tactics and techniques, this course would emphasize the psychological and emotional aspects of effective teamwork. The first challenge came before the course even began. When the roster of candidates was finalized, Rodriguez discovered that Lance Corporal Chun, now Sergeant Chun, had been selected to participate. The young Marine had continued to excel in his career, earning multiple commendations for leadership under fire and developing a reputation as someone who could bring out the best in his fellow Marines. Rodriguez felt a complex mix of emotions about having Chun in his class. On one hand, he knew that Chun already understood the lessons about teamwork and mutual support that Rodriguez would be teaching. On the other hand, having Chun present might create an awkward dynamic given their shared history and the personal nature of the experiences that had shaped Rodriguez's teaching philosophy. When Chun arrived at the training facility, Rodriguez decided to address the situation directly. He met privately with the young Marine to discuss how they should handle their past relationship during the course. "Sergeant Chun," Rodriguez began, "I want you to know that you'll be treated exactly like every other candidate in this program. No special consideration, no references to what happened between us in Afghanistan. You're here on your own merits." Chun nodded, understanding immediately what Rodriguez was trying to accomplish. "Roger that, Master Chief. I wouldn't want it any other way." But Rodriguez also recognized that Chun's presence might actually be an asset to the program. The young Marine embodied the principles Rodriguez was trying to teach, and his natural leadership abilities could help influence other candidates who might be resistant to new ideas about teamwork. The course began with 48 of the military's most accomplished young warriors, each representing the pinnacle of achievement within their respective communities. They were physically impressive, mentally sharp, and supremely confident in their individual abilities. They were also, Rodriguez noted, largely isolated from each other by service loyalty and professional rivalry. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez addressed the assembled candidates, "you are here because you represent the best your services have to offer. Each of you has proven that you can achieve extraordinary things through individual effort and personal excellence." Rodriguez paused, studying the faces before him. He could see the same expression he had worn years earlier, the quiet pride of warriors who believed they needed no one but themselves. "But individual excellence is not enough for the challenges you'll face in your careers," Rodriguez continued. "Modern warfare requires a level of coordination and mutual support that cannot be achieved by simply putting skilled individuals together and hoping they'll work well as a team." The first weeks of the program focused on breaking down the barriers between service branches and creating shared understanding of each group's capabilities and limitations. Rodriguez designed exercises that required candidates from different services to work together on tasks that none of them could complete individually. One particularly effective exercise involved a complex scenario where SEAL candidates had to rely on Air Force pararescue specialists for medical support, while Army Rangers provided security and Marines handled communications. The exercise was structured so that success required genuine interdependence. Each group had essential skills that the others needed, but no group had all the capabilities required for mission success. The initial results were predictably frustrating. Candidates attempted to work around their interdependence, trying to compensate for missing capabilities through individual effort rather than genuine collaboration. SEAL candidates attempted to provide their own medical care rather than trusting Air Force medics. Rangers tried to handle communications internally rather than relying on Marine expertise. Rodriguez watched these early failures with satisfaction. Each unsuccessful attempt at self-reliance reinforced the lesson he was trying to teach, that even the most skilled individuals had limitations that could only be overcome through genuine partnership with others. The breakthrough came during the third week of the program. Rodriguez had designed an exercise that required teams to rescue hostages from a heavily defended compound using limited resources and tight time constraints. The scenario was complex enough that success required not just coordination between service branches, but genuine trust and vulnerability. Chun emerged as a natural leader during this exercise, but not in the way Rodriguez had expected. Instead of taking charge and directing others, Chun consistently looked for ways to support his teammates and create conditions for their success. When SEAL candidates struggled with medical procedures, Chun arranged for Air Force medics to provide additional training. When Rangers faced communications challenges, Chun helped coordinate with Marine specialists. Rodriguez realized that Chun was demonstrating advanced leadership skills that went far beyond what was typically taught in military leadership courses. The young Marine understood that true leadership wasn't about being the strongest or smartest person on the team. It was about helping everyone else become their best selves. Other candidates began to notice Chin's approach and started emulating his behavior. Instead of competing with each other for individual recognition, they began looking for opportunities to help their teammates succeed. The change was gradual but unmistakable, and Rodriguez could see genuine team bonds forming across service lines. But the real test came during the final exercise of the program. Rodriguez had designed a scenario that would push every candidate to their absolute limits, both physically and psychologically. The exercise involved a week-long operation in a remote training area where teams would face constant challenges requiring different combinations of skills and capabilities. On the fourth day of the final exercise, disaster struck. During a particularly challenging mountain traverse, one of the Army Ranger candidates, Staff Sergeant David Kim, suffered a serious fall that resulted in multiple injuries, including a possible head trauma. The candidate was conscious but disoriented, and his condition appeared to be deteriorating. Rodriguez watched from his observation post as the teams dealt with this unexpected crisis. In the past, he might have expected each service group to handle the emergency according to their own procedures, with minimal coordination between branches. Instead, he witnessed something remarkable. Chun immediately took charge of coordinating the rescue effort, but he did so by recognizing and utilizing the specific expertise of candidates from other services. Air Force pararescue specialists provided advanced medical care, while SEAL candidates planned the evacuation route. Marine communications experts coordinated with the exercise controllers, while Army Rangers secured the area. Most importantly, everyone involved accepted their role in the rescue without ego or territorial concerns. SEAL candidates who were accustomed to being the most elite warriors on any team willingly followed the lead of Air Force medics, who had superior medical training. Rangers who prided themselves on their tactical expertise deferred to Marine communications specialists when dealing with complex radio procedures. The rescue was executed flawlessly, with Kim being evacuated to proper medical care within 2 hours of his accident. But more significant than the successful operation was what Rodriguez observed about the candidates' behavior during the crisis. They had stopped thinking of themselves as representatives of different services and had started thinking of themselves as members of a single team with shared responsibilities. When the final exercise concluded and the candidates assembled for the graduation ceremony, Rodriguez could see fundamental changes in their attitudes and relationships. The rivalries and barriers that had characterized the beginning of the program had been replaced by genuine respect and affection between candidates from different services. Gentlemen, Rodriguez addressed the graduating class. 6 weeks ago, you came to this program as 48 individual warriors from 4 different services. Today, you leave as a team that understands how individual excellence can be multiplied through genuine collaboration. Rodriguez paused, looking specifically at Chun and remembering their first meeting in those Afghan mountains. Some of you learned these lessons more easily than others. But everyone in this room has demonstrated that they can put team success ahead of individual recognition, and that they can trust their teammates with their lives. During the graduation reception, Rodriguez was approached by Major General Patricia Harrison, the commanding general responsible for Joint Special Operations training. General Harrison had been observing the program closely and was reportedly considering whether to make it a permanent part of the Special Operations curriculum. Master Chief, General Harrison said, I've been following your program with great interest. The feedback from candidates has been exceptional, and I'm hearing reports from the field that graduates are performing at levels we've never seen before. Rodriguez felt a surge of pride, but he also recognized that the program's success wasn't his alone. Thank you, ma'am. But I think the real credit goes to people like Sergeant Chun who understood these principles long before I started teaching them. General Harrison nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to discuss expanding this program to include senior enlisted personnel and junior officers. We're seeing too many operational failures that result from poor coordination between units, and I think your approach could help address those problems. The conversation with General Harrison marked the beginning of a new chapter in Rodriguez's career. Over the following months, he worked with a team of military educators to develop advanced versions of the Joint Training Program for different ranks and specialties. The basic principles remained the same. Genuine teamwork required vulnerability, trust, and the willingness to put team success ahead of individual recognition. But the applications became more sophisticated as they dealt with more experienced personnel. Rodriguez also began working on a book that would capture the lessons he had learned and share them with a broader military audience. The writing process forced him to reflect deeply on his own transformation from a lone wolf operator to someone who understood that his greatest strength came from his connections with others. The book's central theme was the story of his rescue by Chun and the Marines, but Rodriguez was careful to present it not as a simple tale of heroism, but as an illustration of how ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they genuinely worked together. He emphasized that Chin's actions weren't superhuman. They were the natural result of training that emphasized mutual support over individual achievement. 1 year after the first joint training program, Rodriguez received a letter that would become one of his most treasured possessions. It was from Staff Sergeant Kim, the Army Ranger who had been injured during the final exercise. Master Chief Rodriguez, the letter began, I wanted to update you on how the lessons from your program have affected my unit. When I returned to my company, I started implementing the teamwork principles we learned during the course. The results have been remarkable. Our unit cohesion has improved dramatically, and we've successfully completed several complex operations that would have been impossible using our old approach. The letter went on to describe specific examples of how Rangers, working closely with attached specialists from other services, had achieved mission success through genuine collaboration rather than just coordination. Kim also noted that other graduates from the joint program were reporting similar results from their units. Rodriguez shared Kim's letter with Chun during one of their periodic meetings. The young Marine, now a staff sergeant himself, had become an informal advisor to the joint training program and frequently provided input on curriculum development. You know what's interesting about this letter? Chun said after reading it. He's not talking about what he learned from us. He's talking about what he's teaching other people. The lessons are spreading. Rodriguez nodded, understanding exactly what Chun meant. The goal had never been simply to train individual warriors to work better together. The real objective was to create a cultural shift that would ripple through the special operations community, changing how people thought about strength, leadership, and mutual dependence. 3 years after Rodriguez began teaching, he received the most meaningful recognition of his career, the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his contributions to improving operational effectiveness through enhanced teamwork training. But more important than any official recognition was the knowledge that hundreds of warriors were alive today because they had learned to trust and depend on each other in ways that previous generations of special operators had never been taught. At the awards ceremony, Rodriguez was asked to speak about what had motivated his work as an instructor. He thought about Chin's courage in those Afghan mountains, about the Marines who had risked everything for a stranger, about the students who had gradually learned to put team success ahead of individual glory. Everything I've tried to teach, Rodriguez said. I learned from a young Marine who understood something about strength that took me years to figure out. Real warriors aren't the ones who can stand alone. They're the ones who can help others stand with them. As Rodriguez looked out at the audience, which included many of his former students and colleagues, he realized that his journey from wounded SEAL to master instructor represented more than personal growth. It represented a fundamental shift in how the military thought about developing its most elite warriors. The days of the lone wolf operator, supremely competent but isolated in his excellence, were ending. They were being replaced by something better. Warriors who understood that their individual skills were most valuable when combined with the abilities of others, who measured their success not by personal achievement, but by team accomplishment, and who found their greatest strength not in independence, but in the unbreakable bonds formed with those who shared their commitment to something larger than themselves. Rodriguez had been rescued twice in those Afghan mountains. First, Chun and his Marines had saved his life. But more importantly, they had saved him from a way of thinking that would have ultimately limited his ability to serve others. The wounded SEAL had learned that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the beginning of true strength. The secret code that Chun had spoken wasn't a military cipher or tactical signal. It was something much simpler and much more powerful. The understanding that no one succeeds alone, that real strength comes from genuine connection with others, and that the highest form of courage is the willingness to be vulnerable enough to both ask for help and offer it to others. Rodriguez carried that code with him every day, and through his teaching, he had passed it on to hundreds of other warriors who would carry it forward into battles yet to be fought. The wounded seal had become something more than he had ever been as a lone wolf. He had become part of an unbreakable chain of warriors who understood that their greatest victories would always be won together. "No," Rodriguez said finally. "I don't regret it at all. Getting wounded taught me something I never would have learned otherwise. It showed me what real strength looks like." Chen nodded, seeming to understand exactly what Rodriguez meant. "My grandfather always said that sometimes we have to break before we can become truly strong." As Rodriguez prepared to return to his quarters, Chen stood and extended his hand. "It's been an honor working with you, sir. Keep teaching them what we learned out there." Rodriguez shook the young Marine's hand, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had saved his life in more ways than one. "I will. And, Chun, thank you for everything." After Chen left the base, Rodriguez returned to his work with renewed purpose. He had found his calling as a teacher, someone who could help other warriors avoid the mistakes he had made and embrace the strength that came from genuine teamwork. The wounded seal had discovered that his greatest victories would not be won on distant battlefields, but in the classroom where he could help shape the next generation of warriors who understood that true strength was not about standing alone, but about standing together. Chen smiled and stood to leave. "Actually, sir, there is one thing. When you get back on your feet, remember what you learned out there. Pass it on to other people who might need to hear it." After Chen left, Rodriguez lay in his hospital bed thinking about the young Marine's parting words. Pass it on. The idea seemed simple enough, but Rodriguez realized it represented a fundamental shift in how he approached his relationships with other people. For years, Rodriguez had seen himself as a lone wolf, someone who neither needed nor offered help to others. But Chun had shown him a different way of being strong, one that was based on connection rather than isolation, on mutual support rather than individual achievement. As Rodriguez began planning his return to duty, he found himself thinking not about personal glory or individual accomplishments, but about how he could use his experience to help others. It was a new way of defining success, one that would require him to be more vulnerable and more connected than he had ever been before. The wounded seal was finally beginning to heal, and the scars he would carry would serve as permanent reminders of the day he learned that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from being willing to stand with others. Chen immediately began preparing Rodriguez for movement, using field-expedient techniques to stabilize his broken leg and minimize blood loss during transport. As he worked, the young Marine kept up a steady stream of professional communication with his team, coordinating the extraction plan while simultaneously providing medical care. Rodriguez found himself studying Chen's face as the young man worked. There was something familiar about the intensity, the complete focus on the mission despite personal injury and mortal danger. It reminded Rodriguez of himself at that age, when he had been a young sailor convinced that he could single-handedly save the world. But there was something else too, something that Rodriguez was only beginning to recognize. Chen wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't driven by ego or the need to appear invincible. He was simply doing his job with quiet competence and genuine concern for a fellow warrior's welfare. "Okay, sir, we're going to move on my count," Chen said, positioning himself to help Rodriguez stand. "My team will provide covering fire, but we need to move fast. The extraction bird has about a 2-minute window before enemy fire makes the LZ too hot." Rodriguez nodded, steeling himself for what he knew would be excruciating pain. As Chun helped him to his feet, agony shot through his broken leg like lightning. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological discomfort of being completely dependent on another person for survival. Chen must have sensed his discomfort because the young Marine spoke quietly as they prepared to move. "Sir, I know this isn't easy, but we're all part of the same team out here. Marines, SEALs, doesn't matter. We don't leave anyone behind. As they began their desperate dash toward the extraction zone, Rodriguez realized that Chun had just articulated something that Rodriguez had never fully understood. True strength sometimes meant accepting help from others, and true brotherhood meant being willing to risk everything for a fellow warrior regardless of branch affiliation or personal pride. The lesson was coming at the worst possible time and place, but Rodriguez was finally ready to learn it. Through the rocks as the search party spread out to surround his position. In a few minutes, they would have him cornered with nowhere to run and no chance of fighting his way out. He raised his rifle and centered the scope on the lead searcher, a bearded man in local dress carrying an AK-47. Rodriguez's finger found the trigger and began to apply pressure. In a few seconds, the shooting would start, and it would all be over one way or another. But as he prepared to take the shot that would start his final battle, Rodriguez heard something that made him freeze, the distant sound of helicopter rotors. American helicopters, from the sound of the engines. The Marines hadn't abandoned him after all. They had gone back to call for help. Help was coming, but Rodriguez wasn't sure he would live long enough to see it arrive. The search party had found his blood trail and were closing in fast. He had perhaps 2 minutes before they would be close enough to storm his position. As the helicopter sounds grew louder, Rodriguez made a decision that went against every instinct he had developed over 7 years of special operations. Instead of preparing for a hopeless last stand, he began thinking about how to stay alive long enough for rescue to arrive. Instead of planning to die like a warrior, he started planning to live like someone who understood that survival sometimes required accepting help from others. The transformation wasn't complete. Years of conditioning couldn't be undone in a few minutes of crisis. But it was a beginning. As enemy voices grew closer and friendly helicopters approached, Marcus Rodriguez began the most difficult mission of his career, learning to let other people save his life.